I think first of all, I'm going to ask the speakers, in terms of your own presentations, was there anything in the other presenters' presentations that resonated with you, or even that you took issue with?
I think they all connected very well with each other and sort of emphasized and foregrounded pretty much the same thing about the power of social media and also the power of those that try to suppress voices on social media and elsewhere through social media.
Thank you, Bhuva. Tisha?
Yeah, I guess I really liked listening to Bhuva and Pamela's presentation in terms of seeing data from 2015, 2016 and thinking about how, some of these issues are evolving not just on social media, but in the public kind of in mainstream media as well, and how it might, those two conversations are interlinked.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that I think when you're looking at social media campaigns and hashtag campaigns, unless you're sort of directly involved in them, sometimes you can miss them as the general public. So the ones that kind of permeate into the sort of, the general public discourse, that are kind of passing that kind of pub test, they're the things that are getting spoken about, outside of social media. I think that's when you can start to see that kind of flow-on effect. And I think the bigger issues around Black Lives Matter and Aboriginal Lives Matter, and then kind of looking at the Australia Day, is that I think the mainstream can see that and feel like they're connected to that. Whereas I think with my case study, I know Heather's kind of put a question in the chat there, which is around the limitations of social media in this instance. And I think that can be the limitation, is that when your topic is to do with kind of a marginalized group that's not being discussed in the mainstream as popularly, then that can be the challenge of how do we take it beyond this kind of hashtag movement on social media to a broader kind of conversation happening down at the pub.
Hey, thank you. Now Heather's come out like a question machine, so let's unleash her. So Tisha, Heather's question had a question about the value of connective action theory, and your response to some of the critiques around it.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely heading that way. And just going back to, mainstream media conversations about Black Lives Matter, particularly in 2020 and around June 2020, so many media organizations were quick to call this an international movement and to point at all the kind of sister movements, protests that were taking place outside of the US. But I think looking at this data, I mean, the relationship is much more complicated than that. And I don't think all of these, I think there are different things going on in different countries' protests that aren't all necessarily linked to Black Lives Matter. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you think about the evolution of Black Lives Matter as a movement. It was, the history of it is so closely connected to, Trayvon Martin's killing to begin with. And then, you see the conversations on Twitter have distinctly waxed and waned with the, publicization of further deaths until it's taken, 7 or 8 years to get to this moment now where all of those deaths have been connected into an understanding that this is a systemic issue. And that's, I think I saw in Australia a lot of similar, there were a lot of similar arguments being made, and I do think there are similarities in the issues, but the history and the media attention that's been built up over time just isn't there. And so I don't think the impact is the same. And then I think, I think that's applicable to other movements too. Like I think the Me Too movement, we tend to think of as this, global movement that affects everyone. And in reality, there's been, very different nationalized responses that are important, in different ways, but they're not all connected. It's not all a homogenous movement. And I think the second way in which connective action seems to be potentially failing in this case is I think Black Lives Matter is a point now where it's incorporating allies. So most of the conversation that we're looking at, as I pointed out, was not from Indigenous posters, or, you know, in America wasn't predominantly from Black posters anymore. So it's a question of how allies are incorporated into this movement. And again, connective action suggests that it's this very easy, you know, umbrella that's going to capture everyone as long as they personalize the message. And again, I think it's a little bit more fraught than that. And there's been a lot of problems with the ways that, you know, allies have been trying to incorporate themselves into the movement that I think, you know, is a question for the movement and the direction that they want to go into now. That visibility is important, but it does come at a cost in terms of the kind of messaging and the kind of goals for the movement as well.
Thank you. Another one of Heather's questions goes over to Natalie, which is, have you noticed any limitations on the power of social media?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are, and I think I sort of alluded to that a little bit in my previous kind of response, but I mean, unless the mainstream picks it up, then social media sort of still exists in a vacuum. So why I think the LGBT Fans of Better movement worked and got the traction that it needed was because the media outlets picked it up. And they were the big ones, you know, like that, you know, Variety, the BBC were talking about it. We had outlets here everyone was talking about it beyond just the Twitter and the show and the character. Most people then were like, who is this character? Why is she why is her death, you know, causing such a storm? So again, I think just on its own, it sort of isn't going to do necessarily what you might want it to do. But once you kind of get that that mainstream discussion happening in other mainstream outlets, I think that's where you can start to see the movement take a bit more, trajectory.
Thank you, Natalie. So I've got another question here from Joanne Jacobs. So if we go back to movements like the Arab Spring and compare it with more modern movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter, do the panelists see any difference in the manner in which Twitter audiences responded to the users of the hashtags? Anybody care to offer any comments there?
Yeah, I can answer a bit of that, also connected to Heather's previous question about the evolution of the hashtag itself. We did notice that it was much more foregrounded in social media, mainly on Twitter, before the media picked it up, like Natalie said. And then there was sort of a two-way effect for some time, where certain influences on Twitter were sort of amplifying the message. And what we have seen is that those influences increasingly, as from 2015 to this January's data, we can see the difference that the leaders in that are now Indigenous Australians and Aboriginal Australians leading the conversation. In 2015, it wasn't that obvious, at least from the data we had, which was the 2 days worth of data. But of us, sometimes those 2 days are not nice or happy days, and so sometimes Indigenous and Aboriginal Australians do not do anything on those days around Twitter. They know that it will upset them. So we do have, both of these sort of perspectives to consider. And Arab Spring, I can't talk much about it. We've looked at it and why it failed and kind of things. And Me Too also, one of our studies looked at it in the Chinese context and how it was actually banned in China, the hashtag, especially in Weibo, and how users subverted it through images and pictorials, and women and others continued to talk about the Me Too, but not overtly talking about it, but using different subversive imagery to talk about it with each other. So I think as these social media evolves, people find more and more ways to, once you are censored or cut out or filtered, then the users actually find a way to continue the conversation with new sort of technology or new innovative ways to communicate and so on. So that's what I have noticed so far. I've not studied the Black Lives Movement, and Tisha can probably answer to that.
Yeah, I guess the one thing that I was going to say is that obviously Black Lives Matter and Me Too being such well-known hashtags now, is that they're equally used for, for dissenters to kind of, subvert the conversation basically, or like what we've called discursive appropriation. So people are using Me Too to kind of support, misogynist messages and say that the movement is a hoax and it's all wrong. And I think previous studies have found a lot of like opportunities where in these hashtags and counter hashtags that there's been productive dialogue. I don't know that data very well, but it hasn't really been the case in what I've looked at. I haven't seen a lot of use of this forum for like discussing, issues in depth in a productive way. And it was probably just, a product of the broader polarized landscape as well. But I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if your question is about like whether people are trolling the activists or anything, but I think definitely looking at comment spaces is also something that's really understudied, obviously, because the data is so difficult to collect. And but I think it would be really cool to look at in more detail. Thanks, Joe. What I saw anecdotally with influencers or just with Instagram posts in general is that the chats, the comments on posts, there was a lot of criticism, a lot of pushback, a lot of like trying to educate the poster, and a lot of these conversations were actually really useful. Chats on Instagram in particular are a nightmare to collect, but I would love to study that more at some point. I do think it's super interesting.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions?
I have a question for Nat, if that's okay.
Go for it.
I loved your presentation. The video was very emotional, but I was kind of, and this is kind of, I guess, like, I love that example. It's kind of like textbook convergence culture. I feel like Henry Jenkins would like be all over that. But now I think as a media teacher, I find that like, I always used to do the exercise where I'm like, name a TV show that has a Black character, name a TV show that has a Latinx character. And, it used to be like very, very small. And now with all the distributed platforms and the niche media that students are consuming, A, I have no idea what they're watching or what they're talking about, but B, they seem to have found, there seems to be markets for more, diversity and more diverse representations than there used to be, obviously, because there's more media out there. But I guess, maybe this is an unfair question, like how do you think the algorithm may be positively or negatively affecting the possibilities for better representations of lesbians on the screen?
Yeah, no, it's actually a really fascinating question, because it's one of the things that I've been asking in my interviews with different kind of writers and producers is, does the fear of not getting it right prevent you or stop you from including diverse characters? Or are you sort of more now open to embracing diverse characters, knowing that there is support out there for you if you want to? Obviously, America's got GLAAD, which is like their kind of peak advocacy body for LGBT representation in all kinds of forms of media. But other countries don't necessarily have that kind of advocacy or advisory body. So in Australia, one of the things that I've been kind of looking at is like, what do we have here that can provide that level of service for writers and producers? So beyond the kind of the activism side of that, it becomes more of an industrial response to that movement. And from, I guess, what we're seeing is that it actually worked. So there are more diverse characters. And when you look at even mainstream kind of primetime dramas, we are seeing more characters and more diversity represented. So there's the GLAD report that comes out every year that I guess just talks about, you know, the inclusion of characters, not necessarily how good, bad, or other they were. So we're definitely seeing an increase in characters, but yeah, so whether that's correlative or whether that's caused by this kind of movement is one part. But one of the things that we've also noticed is that this movement also was the kind of catalyst for a lot of people who thought, you know, I'd like to go into screenwriting, or I'd like to be a producer or a director. Go, you know what, if I want my stories told in a certain way, then maybe I need to actually get involved. So we're actually seeing more people from diverse backgrounds getting into the media industry, and then in response, the industry being open to those writers and those producers being involved in those productions. So, I mean, yeah, we're seeing change, not rapid change, but we are seeing small change. I don't even know if that answered your question because it's after 7 o'clock at night, and I'm just going. Thanks, Tisha.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions. So I tend to find this right at the end of the session. Everybody leaves it to the last minute, but that's okay. That's good. Right, so one question we've got is from Michael. One of the issues of the people I work with, refugee migrants on social media, are trolls and personal safety. To what extent did you find activists using social media being threatened, and how did they deal with it? Who wants to have a crack at that?
I'm happy to have a quick crack, and then I'm happy to pass it on. Certainly within the LGBT Fans Deserve Better movement, what they found was that because there was a community, a small but powerful and passionate community that existed in other social media platforms, like mainly Tumblr, who were using Twitter as a way to engage with the producers, was even when they were getting trolls and when they were getting kind of negative attention, was that they had each other's back. So they felt like there was a support network there for them during, during this period where they were putting a lot of their own personal feelings and thoughts out there. And sort of, you know, as in the video, it showed, you know, one young woman coming out to her family, and she did that in a very public way as well, and was doing a lot of that on social media. And, you know, the backlash was definitely there, but because of the queer community being the ones that were driving that that kind of movement, I feel like there was already a support base there. So if you can kind of tap into the support network, then you've got that support when the trolls come looking for you. But maybe Tisha can speak to her troll experience.
Actually, not really, because, you know, the data set that I was looking at now, there weren't a lot of activists. So influencers were getting pushback for sure. And it's the kind that, I don't know, it's been documented. There's a lot of emotional labor behind it, but it didn't seem out of the ordinary to what general level of hate that they get on a daily basis. But I also, it wasn't really the data that I was looking at. Bhuva, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, and that's the reason I mentioned before that many of the activists, Indigenous activists, take time off during that time because they know what's coming. And not all of them, you know, a few of them have declared that this is like stupid time. I just don't want to be on Twitter right now. I'll come back in a couple of days, kind of thing. So I don't know if they're not really threats, but some of them can be construed as threats, but they are mostly these kind of combative arguments and people saying the same thing over and over again about getting over it and modernity and progress and, you know, things like that the other side brings up every time and points out to some sort of stereotypical bullshit. So that is continually happening in this space, especially of Indigenous discourse. But it gets really heightened during the Australia Day, 2 or 3 days. So that's continued to happen. we don't know. We haven't yet done the interviewing phase of the activists and others to find out how it affects them as yet. So that is the next phase of the research. All we have done so far is millions of tweets and analysis and, looking at the evolution of the tweets and the discourse, but no actual conversations with people yet, which is going into the second phase now.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think we've got a question about the nuts and bolts of it in terms of actually getting the data in the first place. So Stephen basically says he's working on studying language-related activism on Facebook, and one of the things he's finding is the accessibility of Facebook's API. So how is life getting better or worse for researchers in this space?
I think, well, I'll go quickly, Bhuva. I think it depends what kind of access you have. Previously, at my old institution, we managed to get access to CrowdTangle, which was hideously expensive, but theoretically it had the fire hose. It didn't have Instagram, but it had Facebook and Twitter data. Although, I'm always a little skeptical of what's coming up on the searches, and always like the amount of posts that you're allowed to download at any given time is fairly limited, to like 10,000 or 40,000, depends. What I was using for my project was CrowdTangle, which again is I have access through institutionally, and that is coming from, I think CrowdTangle has access to like all of the Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, maybe Reddit data as well. But again, some of the searches that I've done have returned some dubious things, and there are some minor limits, but it is a privilege to have, I think. Yeah.
Okay, Bhuva or Natalie?
Data has been the hardest, especially with the Twitter. The API was available that we could use in 2014-15, and then it was all shut down, and they changed it and didn't allow access or downloads, and then they opened it up just this year only for academics, and with all sorts of evidence and so on that we've been trying to get. And we have the firehose access now, but we're not able to filter it to our requirements at the moment. So in a way, yes, they're saying, have it all, here it is. So, but it's like a big library with all the books on the floor at the moment. We don't know what's going on. So we need to be technically able to filter, to look at the data. So in fact, it's a continual learning process, learning journey, for us. Now we're learning technical ways, like, how do we code this data to get this from the database? And how do we use this API that Twitter itself is providing, but it's not really providing very good training to use it. So it's always, we are just chasing the technology all the time when we are in this space, and learning new things and new technologies to just be researchers in the space. So it's not necessarily an ideal research environment. There's no stability in anything. Things can be shut down or given access to, and we are still struggling with access. And even when we do get access, like very recently, there was a time when 1 year we couldn't do anything because there was absolutely no new data we could get unless we set it up in advance or something like that. So it's a continual challenge.
Yeah, and then we even get the sort of follow-on effect from a lot of our ethics committees and ethics boards, where they don't really know, what they want us to be doing with the data and what we can and can't do as well. So I think whilst the quantitative data can be useful in some respects, so I've kind of had to, particularly with Twitter during that time when it was kind of gone, was having to look more at the kind of qualitative analysis and trying to track conversations kind of more manually, rather than trying to pull you know, massive amounts of data and then kind of scrape through that. But yeah, my study was also during that time where Twitter just had this kind of open, you could use it, and then they went, oh, hang on, maybe we don't want that to be the case. So it's a tricky one with data. Yeah.
And also ethics decisions when you're publishing it, you know, anonymizing, de-identifying, but also paraphrasing. We have had to, with another data set which we did about Sydney, homeless people in Sydney, we had to be very careful not to really out anyone. So we had to even paraphrase every tweet so people can't Google the tweet and find out. So it was a very laborious process, and that's the nature of research in the social media space. So.
Okay, so I think we're coming up to time now. Any final comments from any of the panelists? Anything they haven't had the opportunity to say, or even what the questions that they're gonna be looking into next are? Bhuva.
Oh, questions in the future, yeah. There is one project getting up about sort of non-binary, you know, sort of name transitions, and even journal articles, whether we can go back and change the name of the person and things like that. That will have a flow-on effect to everything in the digital social media space also. So as we progress along, I think all of the research, we just, sometimes I feel like I'm chasing trends, and other times we have a small window where we feel like, oh, okay, we found something that, something is really new. And I think, you know, like a moment of epiphany. But unless we are always chasing the data and the trends, we really can't have that moment of epiphany. So it is quite of a fast, like a moving feast.
Thank you, Bhuva. Tisha.
Yeah, I think I really want to go down the line of, I think, something that I mentioned towards the end of my presentation, which is how the commercial and the activist messages are starting to merge a lot more across digital media spaces, and what that means for hashtag activism.
Thank you. And Natalie.
Yeah, I think kind of continuing on with the LGBT kind of focus, a lot of what I'm looking at the moment is in the trans discussions that are happening online, and looking at trans representation in screen media. I think, as we kind of talked before, we're seeing improvement with kind of gays and lesbians and to an extent bisexual identity and people, but there's a lot of kind of dialogue and stuff happening at the moment around trans representation. So I'll be kind of hoping to start that project with a trans colleague of mine to see, you know, what's happening on sort of social media in terms of activist movements in that space. But yeah, obviously there's a lot more work to be done in that space. So when I find the time, I will be continuing that.
Thank you, Natalie. Okay, so come and get a big round of applause for our speakers. Thank you very much. And also to our